Moving on with our discussion of wide area networks, we're going to talk about Internet Connection Basics. And I named this particular video Internet Connection Basics because it allows us to introduce two pretty important terms to the lexicon, and also because we're going to set up one of these elsewhere in the course and in our lab at the end of the video. So special consideration must be taken when connecting LANs to the Internet. First and foremost, if you've set up your LAN right, your inside network will have one of those RFC 1918 non-routable private IP addresses, the 10 dot or the 192.168, and so on and so forth. Those addresses aren't valid on the Internet. If you hand them to an Internet router, most well-configured Internet routers will simply drop the packet and refuse to route it. The other reason you have to give special consideration is that most ISPs assign a small number of public addresses to a business, and you have to use that very small address space to connect multiple internal hosts to the Internet. For example, your ISP may give you 32 IP addresses, and you have 468 computers on your network. Well, how are you going to get 468 computers to use 32 IP addresses? Well, luckily, technology to the rescue. In order to accomplish that, you can use two different technologies, NAT and PAT. Now, PAT stands for Port Address Translation, and it is used to connect multiple computers to the Internet using a single public IP address. Now, one thing to keep in mind, most people refer to this Port Address Translation as NAT. And this includes people that probably actually know better. When most people, myself included, use the term NAT, what we probably usually mean is PAT, or Port Address Translation. And you'll see the difference between the two in my little network diagrams that I've got here in a couple of slides. But just remember that PAT allows you to connect multiple computers through a single IP address. NAT, or Network Address Translation, is used to map an address on one side of a network to a single address on the other side of the network. So it's a one-to-one relationship. You're translating one network address on one network to the same network address on another network. Network address translation most commonly is used if you have overlapping networks. For example, you've just acquired a company and they happen to use the same internal network scheme as you already use. Well, you obviously can't just dump them onto your corporate network. You have to have a device that sits in the middle that translates those addresses so that your route tables don't get all confused when they see the same routes coming from two different directions. So let's give an example of each of these. Here's Port Address Translation, which is what most of these home internet gateways do. You have multiple machines on the inside of your network and they're connecting to a single internet host. So for the sake of argument, here's our internal machine, 192.168.1.50. We want to connect to a web server with the IP address 12.34.56.78. And in the middle we have a router that's acting as our PAT gateway, and it has those two IP addresses, 192.168.1.1, 98.67.54.32 on the outside. So we're assuming for the time being that routing is set up correctly. This guy over here has a default route that points to this guy. So it sends out a packet and it says my source address is 192.168.1.50. My destination is 12.34.56.78 on destination port 80. So my source port is 7000, the destination port is 80. This traffic gets to this PAT router. This router says, well, I need to translate this traffic so that it all goes out this one single address. So this router rewrites the IP header and says the source address is 98.76.54.32, this actual honest-to-God out on the internet address. The source port is 7111. And it does not change the destination address because obviously that's a valid address and a valid port number. Well, this guy then replies back and says, okay, here's my reply. Source address is 12.34.56.78. Source port is 80. Destination address is 98.76.54.32. It's replying to this guy on destination port 7111. This router sees the traffic coming back from this host on this port and says, well, I've mapped this 7111 to port 7000 on this IP address on the inside. So this NAT device, or this PAT device to be more specific, rewrites the header again on the other side to say, hey, the source is still this guy over here, but I'm sending the destination back to this .50 on destination port 7000. So as far as this guy knows, he's directly talking to this guy. There's nothing at all in the middle here, which is as it should be. Now we'll set up both NAT and PAT in our lab, and you'll actually see this in action, and you'll see the debug commands, and it might make a little more sense at that point. So now let's talk about network address translation. We've got a similar setup. We've got a machine over here on the right, this 192.168.1.50. He's talking to a server over here that's at IP address 10.10.10.10. And for whatever reason, we have to have a NAT device here in the middle, and it has these IP addresses on it. It's got 10.10.10, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the inside address is 192.168.1.1. Again, all of our routing is set up properly so that this guy's default gateway is this NAT device. So, this guy sends out a request on port 80. The source address is me on port 7000. The destination address is 10.10.10.10 on destination port 80. This NAT device then translates this 192.168.1.50 address to 10.10.10.2. So it changes the source address to 10.10.10.2. It does not translate the port. The source port is the same on both sides of the connection. The only thing that changes is the network address. The destination address is 10.10.10.10 on destination port 80. Of course, the reply comes back to 10.10.10.2, which is on the outside of this NAT device, and it rewrites the header on the backside to send it back to this 192.168.1.50 address. So you can see the difference between port address translation and network address translation. The port address translation, for the most part, also includes network address translation because 99.99999% of the port address translation usage out there is for connecting to the internet through a single IP address or a pool of dynamically assigned IP addresses. However, network address translation does stand alone because all it does is modify the network address. I use this on my current job where I have a policy set up in a Cisco ASA that says if you're going to this remote host that's on the other end of a VPN tunnel and you are connecting to it on port 80, that I'm going to NAT your address to one of these agreed upon addresses that the other end will accept as valid connecting addresses. So NAT does have its place just like PAT has its place, and we'll see both of them in the lab. But for now, this concludes our discussion of Internet connection basics.